The old woman was $12 short. That's all it was. $12. For a birthday cake she'd come to buy the same week every year for 6 years running. Her name was Rosa Caruso, 72 years old, gray wool sweater, faded scarf, counting the same folded bills over and over at a bakery counter that had quietly raised its prices without telling her. Behind her stood 4 women in cashmere coats, and one of them lifted a phone to record it. They laughed. They laughed harder when she said softly that the cake was for her son. Then a woman in a delivery uniform set down her pickup order and stepped between them. Her name was Tessa Marlowe, 27, hands still cold from the road, $11 in her pocket, and rent coming due in 9 days. She didn't have anything left to give, and she gave it anyway, and by the time she walked out of that bakery, she'd lost the only work keeping her family afloat. She had no idea who the old woman's son was, neither did the women who laughed. 60 floors above that street, in an office no camera has ever entered, there's a man this city says the name of carefully. Almost nobody alive knows his face. He hasn't spoken to his mother in 6 years, and there's a reason for that, a reason even he doesn't understand yet. By morning, a stranger's video will be everywhere, and one small act of kindness is about to reach a door that's stayed shut for 6 years. If you love stories about dignity, family, and what it costs to do the right thing, hit that like button so more people can find this one. Share it with someone who still believes decency matters. And subscribe, because there's a new story waiting for you every week. Now let's go back to that bakery, to a woman with $11 in her pocket, and to the $12 that changed everything. That same afternoon, a few blocks from the bakery, on the top floor of the Caruso Holdings building, the last sunlight of the day stretched through the thick glass and cast a long amber glow across the dark wooden conference table. There were 4 people in the room, but only 3 of them were still standing. The 4th was kneeling on the carpet in the middle of the room, both hands braced against the floor, his shoulders trembling violently, and the sound of his breathing was the only thing that could be heard in that space. He had a name that, by the following week, no one in the city would ever mention again. He ran a small transportation company, and for the past several months, he had been secretly hiding crates of contraband among the legitimate shipments passing through the harbor, the kind of cargo that everyone in Chicago knew was absolutely forbidden from ever appearing there. Seated at the head of the table was a man in a black suit, without a tie, the top button of his shirt undone. He hadn't spoken a single word since the other man entered the room. He had merely sat there, one hand resting lightly on the tabletop, and watched. There was a faint scar above his left eyebrow, so old that a person would have to stand very close to see it, and no one in this city was permitted to stand that close to him. His name was Enzo Caruso. All of Chicago knew that name. People spoke it in boardrooms, over business dinners, and during phone calls made at midnight, but they always lowered their voices by half a tone when they did. The harbor belonged to him, the transportation routes belonged to him, and so did the silence of every person who worked there. The strangest thing, and the thing that frightened people most of all, was that not a single portrait of Enzo Caruso existed. The city press had hunted for that face through season after season, and found nothing. There was one photograph taken secretly from a distance, and published several years earlier, so blurred that it showed nothing more than the back of a man dressed in black, stepping down onto a pier, and that was the closest glimpse the outside world had ever gotten. People knew his name. Almost no one still alive knew his face. The man on the floor began to beg. He said he'd been forced into it, that he hadn't had a choice, that he would repay every last dollar. Enzo allowed him to finish. Then he opened the briefcase beside him, removed something thin and delicate, and slid it across the table toward the man. It was a plane ticket, one way. The man looked up, not understanding. Enzo finally spoke, and his voice was low and measured, without the slightest trace of anger, the voice of a man who had never needed to raise it in order to be heard. He said the man had a family. He said family mustn't ever be placed on the board, that it was the only rule he had never broken in all those years, and that it was because of that rule that the man would still be allowed to walk out of this room on his own tonight. He added that the flight departed at dawn, that the man should be there, and that he mustn't ever make Enzo hear his name again. The man took the ticket in both hands like someone who had just been granted mercy, stammered his thanks, and was escorted outside. The door closed. Only 2 men remained in the room. Grady Nolan stood beside the window, the man who had followed Enzo for 15 years, the only person in the building who was allowed to speak plainly to him. He quietly remarked that the boss had gone easy on the man. Enzo didn't turn around. His eyes remained fixed beyond the glass, where the city lights below were coming on one by one. He replied that he hadn't gone easy on him at all. He had taken the man's company, taken his name from this city, taken everything the man had spent his entire life building. He had spared only one thing. Grady asked what that was. Enzo remained silent for a long while, then said he had left the man a place to return to, and someone sitting there waiting for him. The very thing Enzo himself didn't have. The words fell into the room and lay there in silence. Grady didn't answer. He merely cast a quick glance toward the desk against the wall, toward the upper left drawer, the drawer into which, every year, he personally placed an envelope, though he had never once seen any of them opened. He knew what was inside. He also knew that, in this building, there were questions a wise man would never ask. About 40 minutes west of that glass building by car, in an old apartment complex where the elevator had been broken for so long that no one even bothered to repair it anymore, there was a tiny one-bedroom apartment, and the woman who lived there had been awake since before dawn. Tessa Marlowe sat up on the sofa where she had slept every night for the past 2 years, folded the thin blanket into a neat square, and tucked it underneath, because if she left it where it could be seen, her younger brother would notice it again, and every time he did, he insisted that they switch places. The bedroom belonged to Wade. She had decided that on the day their mother died, and she wouldn't allow anyone to argue about it. She washed her face with cold water, tied up her hair, and walked into the kitchen. There was only half a carton of eggs and a loaf of bread nearing its expiration date in the cupboard, but that was enough. She cracked the eggs into a pan, and while she waited, her gaze fell upon the glass jar sitting on top of the refrigerator. A faded piece of paper was taped to it, bearing words she had written with her own hand one summer long ago, words that said this money was for Wade's ears. Inside, small bills and coins filled less than half the jar. She had been putting money into it for years, a little each day, and on some days only a few dollars. Yet the level rose so slowly that she sometimes felt as though it hadn't moved at all. Beside the jar was the stack of letters that had arrived that month, and on top was the same familiar envelope from the hospital, the envelope that came once every month. Steady, patient, never forgetting, carrying the figures of the medical debt left behind by a mother who had been in the ground for 2 years. As she always did, Tessa slipped it beneath the rest of the mail without opening it. Wade came out when the smell of fried eggs began to spread throughout the apartment, his hair sticking up on one side and his eyes still heavy with sleep. At 19, he stood a full head taller than his sister, and whenever they stood beside each other, Tessa found herself wondering when her little brother had grown so quickly. He raised one hand in greeting and asked in sign language whether she had slept well. Tessa answered with her hands, telling him that she had slept wonderfully and that the sofa was even more comfortable than the bed. Wade narrowed his eyes at her for a moment, then signed that she was such a terrible liar it was almost pitiful. Tessa laughed and tilted her head toward the chair, telling him to sit down and eat. The brother and sister sat across from each other at the small table, talking through quick, familiar gestures, the language they had shared since they were both very young, the language their mother had learned alongside her children through countless nights when she came home exhausted after work. Wade told her about a classmate at trade school who had burned out an entire electrical circuit the day before, and his hands described the scene so vividly that Tessa had to cover her mouth as she laughed. Then she stood to get more water, and while her back was turned, she murmured something very softly to herself, a question about how many deliveries she would need to complete that day to make enough money. She thought no one had heard her. But when she turned around, Wade was staring directly at her mouth, and something in his eyes had changed. He had read every word. He always could. Ever since he was a child, all he had needed was a clear view of another person's lips to know what they were saying, even if they stood far away on the other side of a pane of glass or across a kitchen doorway. Wade didn't sign anything. He reached for the notepad on the table, picked up the pen that was always kept beside it, wrote a single line, and pushed it toward his sister. There were only a few words on the paper. Stop trying to carry everything alone. I don't need to hear. I just need you not to collapse. Tessa stared at the note for a long time. Her throat began to burn, but she lifted her head, gave him a bright smile, and signed for him to finish his eggs before they grew cold. Then she turned quickly toward the door before he could see her eyes. She slung the square delivery bag over her shoulder, slipped on her shoes with their worn soles, and opened her phone. The first order of the day had just appeared on the screen. It was a bakery pickup, and the address was in the wealthy neighborhood on the north side. at a bakery called Beaumont. That same morning, in the neighborhood on the north side where every storefront was faced with stone and the glass doors were always polished to a spotless shine, an elderly woman walked slowly along the sidewalk, one hand holding tightly to the strap of the cloth bag hanging at her side. She wore a gray sweater worn thin at the elbows and a scarf that had once been dark blue but had now faded almost completely. She walked slowly, not because she was tired, but because she wanted to arrive at exactly the right time, neither early nor late, just as she did every year. The bell above the door of Beaumont Bakery gave a soft chime when she pushed it open and stepped inside. The air smelled of butter and caramelized sugar, a fragrance Rosa Caruso knew by heart. The young woman behind the counter looked up, and her gaze lingered on Rosa's sweater longer than necessary, then traveled down to her shoes before returning to the screen in front of her, with the expression of someone who had already decided this was going to take time. Rosa didn't notice, or perhaps she had grown so accustomed to such looks that she no longer noticed them at all. She approached the counter, set down her bag, and gave the order she had placed once a year for more seasons than she could count. A small honey lemon cake, no writing on top, with only a thin layer of frosting. Her voice was steady and clear, the voice of someone who knew exactly what she wanted, and had wanted it for a very long time. The young woman behind the counter tapped several keys, then looked up with mild surprise and asked whether Rosa had placed an advance order. Rosa said she came during this same week every year, and that the former owner had always kept one ready for her. The young woman replied that the bakery had changed ownership at the beginning of the year, that the former owner had retired, and that things were different now. Rosa nodded and said that was all right. She would still buy it. The young woman went into the back, returned with the cake, placed it on the counter inside a white cardboard box printed with gold lettering, and stated the price. Rosa went still for half a heartbeat. That wasn't the figure she had carried in her mind throughout the past year. The figure she had carefully calculated from her meager pension. The figure she had already folded into a small stack and tucked into the innermost compartment of her wallet 2 days earlier. She opened her wallet, took out the stack of bills, and began to count. She counted them once, her fingers trembling slightly, then smoothed each bill flat and counted them a second time, more slowly and more carefully, as though the total might change if only she counted with greater care. But it didn't. She was $12 short. As she stood there with the money in her hands, the cake box resting on the counter between them, and the young woman behind the counter began tapping her fingers against the glass. No one in the bakery knew where that cake was going. No one knew that every year, after leaving this bakery, Rosa would take a bus for another 2 stops, get off in the financial district, and enter the lobby of a building so tall that she had to tilt her head all the way back to see the top. There, she would place the box on the reception counter, give her name, give the recipient's name, then take a small card from her bag and set it on the lid. The security guard would nod to her with perfect courtesy. Then she would turn away, walk back outside, descend the steps, and wait for the bus that would take her home. It had been that way for 6 years, and not once had she been allowed beyond the ground floor of that building. She had never asked why. She merely told herself that her son was busy, that he would receive the cake, and that this was enough. Rosa looked up, intending to tell the young woman behind the counter that she would hurry home for the rest of the money and return immediately, even though she knew the journey would take nearly half the day. But before she could speak, the bell above the door chimed again. 4 women entered, bringing with them the scent of expensive perfume and the lingering sound of laughter, pale cashmere coats draped over their shoulders. The woman leading them, a neatly styled blonde who carried herself like someone who had never once been made to wait in line for anything, stopped directly behind Rosa. The blonde woman's name was Meredith Hale, and in the city's real estate circles, that name was enough to make people answer their phones on the very first ring. She stood about 2 steps behind Rosa, her hands resting loosely in the pockets of her coat, and she didn't appear impatient at all. She merely tilted her head and observed the scene before her with the polite curiosity of someone watching a television program she hadn't intended to see, but had unexpectedly found rather entertaining. Then she spoke, and her voice was sweet, gentle, and so warm that if someone heard only the sound and not the words, they might have thought she was asking after the health of an old acquaintance. She asked the young woman behind the counter whether the bakery accepted assistance payments, because it seemed there might be someone here who needed one. The 3 women accompanying her burst into laughter. One of them, the woman in the cream-colored coat, took out her phone and raised it without the slightest attempt to hide what she was doing. Her finger pressed the record button, and she aimed the phone directly at the counter, while whispering to her friend that this would probably get a lot of views once she posted it. Rosa heard every word. She lowered her head toward the money in her hands and counted it a third time, even though she knew perfectly well that the total would remain the same. Her fingers trembled more violently, and the wallet slipped from her hand, fell onto the stone floor, and sprang open. Coins spilled out and scattered in every direction across the polished stone, their rolling echoes filling the bakery with a bright, metallic clatter that seemed to go on and on without end. Rosa bent down to gather them. Not one of the 4 women moved. Neither did the young woman behind the counter. Meredith merely stepped back half a pace to keep one coin from touching the toe of her shoe, then lightly brushed the sleeve of her coat, though there was nothing on it. She said she wasn't trying to be unkind, but the shops in this neighborhood all maintained a certain standard, and people had to consider the comfort of the other customers as well. In the right corner of the bakery, near the window, a young customer sat alone with a cup of cold coffee. She had stopped drinking when Rosa began counting her money for the second time. She didn't laugh or say a word. She quietly placed her phone on the table, propped it at an angle against the sugar jar, and began recording. No one noticed her. Rosa finished gathering the coins and rose slowly, her knees making faint sounds as she straightened. She placed everything on the counter, adding every loose coin to the small stack of bills, and said in a quiet but steady voice that she was sorry for wasting everyone's time, that she would go home for the rest of the money and return later to collect the cake. Still using that same voice, Meredith asked whether the cake must be very special for Rosa to go to so much trouble. Rosa looked up. Perhaps it was because she had been standing there for too long, or because someone had finally asked her a question, but she answered honestly. She said that today was her son's birthday. She said he had loved honey lemon cake since he was a very little boy, back when she used to bake it for him herself in the small kitchen in their old neighborhood, and that she bought him one every year. The entire bakery fell silent for a heartbeat. Then Meredith Hale smiled. It wasn't a smile of contempt. It was something closer to pity, and that made it 10 times crueler. She said Rosa's son must be very busy. Then she continued slowly, one word at a time, saying that he must be so busy he would let his own mother go out alone to buy his birthday cake. Standing in the middle of a bakery counting loose change, dressed like this, the other 3 women erupted into laughter. The phone propped on the corner table near the window was still recording, but Rosa could no longer hear the laughter. She stood there with one hand still resting on the counter, unable to say anything at all, because of all the words that had just been thrown at her. Not one of them was untrue. Not one of them was a lie. In the middle of a brightly lit bakery, this stranger had spoken aloud the very thought Rosa had never once allowed herself to finish in her own mind throughout those 6 years. It wasn't an insult. It was the truth. And there was no way to argue with the truth. Tessa Marlowe had been standing near the pickup counter for some time, holding the bag containing the first order of the day, while she waited for an employee to finish boxing a customer's cake. She had heard everything from beginning to end. She had heard the question about assistance payments, heard the coins rolling across the stone floor, and heard the final burst of laughter. And she had remained still, because she knew exactly who she was in that room. She knew that someone wearing a delivery uniform had no voice in places like this, and she knew the rent was due in 9 days. She had told herself that it wasn't her concern. Then she saw the old woman's shoulders collapse. Tessa placed the delivery bag on the counter, took 3 steps forward, and positioned herself between Rosa and the 4 women. The entire bakery fell silent. Meredith Hale looked her over, beginning with the worn soles of her shoes, and moving up to the square delivery bag on her back. Then she raised one eyebrow slightly and asked what Tessa wanted. Tessa said she wanted them to stop. She said this elderly woman wasn't bothering anyone, hadn't said a single word to anyone, and was merely standing there counting her own money. Meredith smiled and replied that this was a private matter between a customer and the bakery, while Tessa was only there to deliver food. Tessa nodded and said that was true. She was only a delivery worker. Then she asked them a question. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried all the way to the back of the bakery. She asked whether they had ever considered that one day they would grow old too, that a day would come when their hands would tremble, their eyes would grow dim, and they would stand before strangers counting the same stack of money over and over again. She asked whether, when that day came, they would want someone standing behind them, laughing in their faces and recording them. The woman holding the phone lowered her hand. The other 3 women stopped laughing. Only Meredith's expression remained unchanged. She studied Tessa for another moment, then calmly raised her phone and took a picture. Not of Tessa's face, but of the name badge fastened to the front of her uniform. She said she never raised her voice at anyone. She merely signed papers. Then she walked a few steps away, placed a call, and began speaking into the phone in a completely different voice, one that trembled like the voice of someone who had just been threatened in a public place. She said a delivery worker had lunged at her, that she felt unsafe, and that she would send the evidence immediately. Her friend in the cream-colored coat trimmed the video she had just recorded, keeping only the exact moment Tessa took those 3 steps toward them, and pressed send. The bakery manager came out from the back, saw Meredith, saw Tessa, then lowered her gaze to the countertop and didn't look up again. No one defended anyone. Tessa didn't argue another word. She turned her back on them, knelt on the floor, and began gathering the coins that were still scattered beneath the chairs, under the counter, and along the wall. She picked them up one by one, patiently and without rushing, then placed them all in Rosa's palm and gently closed the old woman's fingers around them. After that, Tessa opened her own wallet. Inside was $11, the money she had set aside to pay for enough gas to last the entire day. She placed every dollar on the counter, added it to Rosa's money, and told the young woman behind the counter that surely it was enough now. They were still $1 short. The young customer seated near the window rose, walked over, placed a bill on the counter without saying anything, and returned to her seat. The white cardboard box with gold lettering was pushed toward Rosa. Tessa took the cake box in one hand, supported the old woman's elbow with the other, and helped her toward the door. The bell gave another soft chime behind them. When they reached the sidewalk, the cold wind struck their faces, and Rosa still hadn't managed to say a word. At that exact moment, the phone in Tessa's pocket vibrated. She took it out and looked at the screen. A notification from the delivery application, written in language that was polite and cold, informed her that her account had been suspended indefinitely following a complaint of aggressive behavior toward a customer, and that she could file an appeal within 30 business days. The bag containing her first order of the day was still sitting on the counter inside the bakery behind her. The young customer who had been sitting near the window arrived home after dark. She sat in front of her computer for a long time. She didn't trim the footage, add music, or place any words over it. She simply uploaded the entire video she had recorded with a short caption explaining that this was what she had witnessed that morning at a bakery in the city, and that she wouldn't be able to sleep if she left it buried on her phone. By midnight, the video had traveled farther than anything she had ever posted in her life. By dawn, it was everywhere. The group of women in the bakery that morning had calculated everything except one thing. They thought the crowd would laugh with them, but the crowd didn't laugh. Tens of thousands of people, then hundreds of thousands, left furious comments beneath the video, and most of them didn't mention the cashmere coats or the laughter. They wrote about the trembling hands that had counted the money 3 times. They wrote about the woman in the delivery uniform who had knelt on the floor and gathered every coin from beneath the counter. Many people wrote that they had cried at 4 o'clock in the morning because the video made them think of their own mothers. Grady Nolan watched it at 7:15 that morning in his kitchen, still holding a cup of coffee. He watched the entire thing. Then he watched it again from the beginning. During the second viewing, he lowered the cup to the table without even realizing he had done so. He had seen that face a few times in his life, though never directly, and he had never been permitted to offer a greeting. He had only glimpsed it from a distance, through a car window or over someone else's shoulder, and every time had been during the same week of the year, in the same building lobby. He set down his phone and sat motionless for a very long time, knowing that he was about to do the most difficult thing he had done in 15 years. 40 minutes later, he stood outside the office door on the highest floor of the Caruso Holdings building. He didn't knock immediately. He remained there for nearly a minute, raising his hand and then lowering it again. The secretary seated outside glanced at him in confusion, because no one in that building had ever seen Grady Nolan hesitate over anything. At last, he knocked, stepped inside, placed the tablet on the desk in front of Enzo, and spoke only one sentence. The boss needed to see this, and Grady was sorry. Enzo pressed the button. The only sound in the office came from the small speaker. Coins rolling across stone. Laughter. Then a woman's sweet voice saying a few words, followed by silence. The video ended. Enzo said nothing. He didn't rise, replay it, ask who had recorded it, or ask where it had happened. He merely sat motionless, staring at the screen after it had gone black. While 2 minutes passed inside that room, Grady remained exactly where he was, barely daring to breathe. Everyone in the building knew one thing. When Enzo Caruso shouted, nothing serious had happened yet. When he fell silent, someone was going to lose everything they had. But this time, Grady saw something different. He saw that the hand his boss had resting on the desk was trembling, very faintly, almost imperceptibly. But Grady had followed this man for 15 years, and he had never once seen that hand shake, not even on the nights when the entire harbor had stood at the edge of disaster. And he understood that it wasn't anger. Grady knew anger all too well. This was something entirely different, something he had never imagined he would one day witness in this room. It was shame. Enzo finally spoke, and his voice was rougher than usual. He gave 2 orders. First, he wanted to know everything about the woman in the delivery uniform. Her name, where she lived, who she lived with, and what trouble she was facing. He emphasized that it had to be done quietly. She mustn't know, and she mustn't be frightened. His second order was that no one was to touch the other woman yet. Grady looked up, slightly surprised. Enzo said he wanted to know who she was first. Grady nodded, picked up the tablet, and turned to leave. When he reached the door, he stopped. On the desk, directly beside the place where the tablet had been resting, lay the file for the harbor deal that had been in preparation for months. The agreement scheduled to be signed the following week. Embossed across its cover in dark blue ink was the logo of Hale Development. Go back to noon that same day, before the video had been posted, and before the city knew anything about what had happened. And there were 2 women standing on the sidewalk outside the bakery. One had just lost her job, and hadn't yet fully understood what had happened. The other still hadn't managed to speak. Tessa slipped her phone into her pocket, decided that she would deal with her own troubles later, and asked Rosa where she lived so she could drive her home. Rosa shook her head and said she could take the bus, that Tessa had already done far too much. Tessa replied that her scooter was parked just around the corner, that she didn't have any more deliveries to make that day anyway, and those words made the old woman look up at her. Rosa didn't refuse again. Her apartment was on the 2nd floor of an old building on the south side of the city, with windows overlooking a concrete courtyard where 2 benches stood. The inside was strangely immaculate, every object resting in its proper place, and there were 2 chairs at the dining table against the wall, though only one bore marks of wear along its back. Tessa placed the cake box on the table, then found the kettle and the tea herself, because Rosa's hands were still trembling, and she kept standing in the middle of the room like someone who had forgotten what she meant to do. Tessa intended to make the tea and then leave, but when she set a cup in front of the old woman, Rosa took hold of her wrist, not firmly, only gently, and Tessa lowered herself into the other chair. She stayed there throughout the afternoon. Rosa told her story slowly and haltingly, sometimes pausing for a very long time between one sentence and the next. She spoke of the years when she was young, when her husband had died early, and she had been forced to work 2 jobs at once, spending her days in a garment factory and her nights cleaning offices. She spoke of the little kitchen in their old neighborhood, where she had baked cakes for her son with her own hands because she couldn't afford to buy them from a bakery. She said the boy had loved honey lemon cake, that he always licked the plate clean when he finished, and that one year she had ruined it completely, and the cake had come out flat. But he had still told her it was delicious. Then her voice grew quieter. She said that when he was 16, he had once sat at this very table and watched her rubbing her hands together, the skin cracked from the chemicals she used to clean floors, and he had made her a promise. He had told her that one day she wouldn't have to do anything anymore, that all she had to do was sit still and he would take care of everything. Rosa smiled as she reached that part, a very small smile, then said that he had kept his promise. He had kept it too well. Money began arriving regularly, every month, and the amount kept growing. It was enough for her to stop working, enough that she never had to worry about anything again. Then one day, he stopped coming. There had been no anger, no argument, and not a single word of explanation. One day he simply didn't come, and he didn't come the next day either, and that was how it had remained until now. Tessa asked whether Rosa had called him. Rosa said she didn't have his number. The old one had been changed long ago. Then she added that she still knew he was alive, and she said it with a strange certainty that Tessa didn't understand, the voice of someone who knew more than she was willing to reveal. Rosa rose, opened a drawer in the sideboard, took out a thick, worn envelope, placed it on the table, and pushed it toward Tessa. There was money inside, a great deal of it, every bill still crisp and new. Rosa said this was the money for the current month, and that there was more in the cabinet, so much that she didn't even count it. She said she hadn't spent a single dollar of it, not because she was angry, but because she didn't know what she was supposed to spend it on. Then she said something Tessa would remember for a very long time. Rosa said she didn't need her son's money. She only needed to sit down and share one meal with him. Just one meal would be enough, so she could see whether he had grown thinner or put on weight, so she could ask whether he had been sleeping well lately. She said she was a good cook. But now there was no one left for her to cook for. Tessa opened her mouth to say something, but nothing came out of her throat, because in her mind was another kitchen from 2 years earlier, and another woman lying in a hospital bed, repeatedly asking Tessa whether she had eaten that day, even though that woman herself hadn't been able to eat anything for weeks. Tessa remembered giving her a careless answer just to satisfy her, because she still had to hurry away for an extra night shift. She sat there in a stranger's apartment, both hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold, wishing she had stayed for just 15 more minutes. From that day on, Tessa began stopping by the apartment. At first, she told herself she was only checking in to make sure the old woman was all right, and then she would leave. But each time, she stayed longer than she intended, and before long, those visits became part of her day, the only part she looked forward to. Rosa always saved something for her, sometimes a bowl of soup, sometimes a few slices of toast, and she would always be standing at the window, looking down into the courtyard half an hour before Tessa was due to arrive. Then, one Thursday afternoon, Tessa's phone rang from a number she didn't recognize. The person on the other end was a desk officer at the police station on the south side, asking whether she was related to Rosa Caruso, because the elderly woman had written Tessa's number on the back of an old receipt in her coat pocket. Tessa abandoned everything and hurried there. Rosa was sitting in a plastic chair in the corner of the room, her hands resting neatly in her lap, her grocery bag still untouched beside her feet. They told Tessa that Rosa had stood at an intersection near the market for more than an hour, asking no one for help and calling no one, merely looking back and forth at the 4 streets around her, until a fruit vendor sensed that something was wrong and approached her. She couldn't remember where she lived. When Tessa entered, Rosa looked up, and the first thing she said wasn't that she was frightened or tired. She apologized for troubling her. Rosa didn't say a word during the entire drive home. It wasn't until they reached the apartment, and she had settled into her familiar chair, that she admitted this had been happening for several months. There were times when she stood in the middle of her own home and couldn't remember what she had been about to do. One day, she had turned on the stove and then walked into the other room to sit down. She said she hadn't dared tell anyone because she was afraid they would put her away somewhere, and she had to remain here. She had to stay in this exact apartment in case someone came back looking for her. Tessa sat quietly and listened to everything. Then she took an old phone from her bag, the one she had kept as a spare since her mother was still alive, with a small crack in one corner of the screen. She plugged it in, turned it on, adjusted several settings, and placed it in Rosa's palm. She showed Rosa how to make a call. All she had to do was hold her finger in one place, and the phone would call Tessa automatically. Tessa added that she had activated a small feature that would always let her know where Rosa was, and all Rosa needed to do was keep the phone in her coat pocket and never turn it off, even while she slept. Rosa held the phone in both hands, turned it over, and stared for a long time at the crack in the corner of the screen. Then she asked whether Tessa was certain she didn't need it. Tessa said she already had another one. The old woman nodded, opened the button on her sweater pocket, slipped the phone inside, and fastened the button again with great care. She didn't thank Tessa. She merely placed her hand over that pocket and kept it there for a while, the way someone might hold on to a promise rather than an object. That evening, Rosa rose, went into the kitchen, opened the cupboard, took out a jar of honey and 3 lemons, then called Tessa in. She said she was going to teach her. She told Tessa to stand beside her, then demonstrated each step one by one. The lemon zest had to be grated very thin, taking only the yellow part, because if the grater reached the white beneath it, the cake would become bitter. The honey had to be added while the batter was still warm, not while it was hot. She explained these things in the voice of someone who had done them hundreds of times throughout her life, without needing a scale or a recipe written on paper. Tessa asked where she had learned. Rosa said she had invented it herself. They had been so poor back then that she simply made do with whatever she had. Then she fell silent for a moment, her hand still moving steadily through the batter, and said softly that she was teaching Tessa now, so that if she forgot someday, there would still be someone who remembered. While those quiet afternoons in the apartment on the south side continued to pass peacefully, Every other part of Tessa's life was closing its doors one by one. She filed an appeal with the delivery application on the very first day and received an automated response, followed by another several days later saying that her case was under review and that she would be notified when a decision had been reached. No one called her. She applied to other delivery applications, and all three rejected her, saying they already had enough workers in her area. She began looking for jobs outside the delivery business. The coffee shop near her apartment had a help wanted sign in the window, and the owner spoke warmly with her for 20 minutes, told her she could start on Monday, then sent a message that same afternoon saying she had found someone else. The supermarket at the end of the street did the same thing. A restaurant downtown invited her to an interview, and the manager shook her hand firmly. But when Tessa handed him her documents, he looked at her name, excused himself for a moment, and when he returned, his face had completely changed. He merely said the position had just been filled and wouldn't meet her eyes. Tessa walked out, stood on the sidewalk, and for the first time wondered whether someone was standing ahead of her at every door she intended to knock on. She pushed the thought away, telling herself that thinking that way would only drive her mad. At the end of that week, the landlord knocked on her door. With genuine regret in his voice, he said he was very sorry, that the increase applied to everyone in the building and not only to her, and that he would give her 2 additional weeks. Tessa thanked him, closed the door, and stood with her back against it for a long while before walking into the kitchen. She cooked dinner as she did every evening and told Wade nothing. Then, on Wednesday afternoon of the following week, the hospital called. The woman on the other end spoke quickly, her voice urgent but cheerful, explaining that a patient on the list had postponed surgery for personal reasons, that the opening was now available, and that Wade Marlowe's file was next in line. She said that if the family could pay the deposit within 3 weeks, he would be placed on the schedule for the following month. If they couldn't, his file would automatically be moved to the next review period, and that would mean waiting at least another 2 years. Tessa asked how much the deposit was. The woman gave her the figure. Tessa stood motionless in the middle of the living room, with the phone pressed to her ear, and she realized that the amount matched almost to the last dollar, the distance between the money inside the glass jar on top of the refrigerator and the goal she had been moving toward for years. She had traveled almost the entire way. Only the final stretch remained, and she had just lost her job. She thanked the woman, said she would make the necessary arrangements, and ended the call. That night, after Wade had gone into his room and every light in the apartment had been turned off, Tessa sat down on the sofa in the darkness. She intended to sit for a moment and then sleep, but she remained there for a very long time, until at last she bent forward, covered her face with both hands, and cried. She cried very quietly, struggling to hold back every sound, because that habit had stayed with her throughout the past 2 years, even though there was no one in the apartment who could actually hear her. She cried for her mother, for the hospital envelope that arrived every month, for the 2 weeks the landlord had given her, for the 3 weeks the hospital had given her, and for every door that had closed at once. She didn't hear the footsteps. It wasn't until a hand settled on her shoulder that she startled and looked up. Wade stood there in the darkness, and she didn't know how long he had been watching her. He sat down beside his sister. In his hands was the glass jar from the top of the refrigerator, the one with the faded piece of paper taped to it. He placed it in her lap, then raised his hands and began to sign, slowly, one gesture at a time. Use this. Pay the rent first. Eat first. Live first. My ears can wait a little longer, but you can't. Tessa looked down at the jar in her lap, at the coins and small bills she had placed inside it every day through more seasons than she could count. Then she set it aside, pulled her brother close, and held him tightly. She shook her head again and again, but she didn't sign anything, because she knew that in the darkness, he wouldn't be able to see her hands. The next morning, she returned the glass jar to the top of the refrigerator, exactly where it had always been, then walked along the main street on the east side and asked for work at every store she passed. At the 9th place, someone hired her. It was an all-night diner beside the elevated train tracks, with yellowed tile floors, and the manager said he needed someone to wash dishes on the night shift, from 10 o'clock at night until 6 o'clock in the morning, paid by the hour, with no regular days off. Tessa accepted immediately. She also managed to sign up with a smaller delivery application, one that operated in only a few neighborhoods. There weren't many orders, and the pay was considerably lower, but they didn't ask about her account history. From that day forward, She made scattered deliveries during the day, visited Rosa in the afternoon, returned home in the evening to cook dinner for Wade, then slept for about 2 hours on the sofa before leaving the apartment at 9:30. On the 4th night of the 2nd week, it began to rain. It wasn't heavy, only a light, relentless drizzle, just enough to make the streets shine and cold enough to seep through her coat. She accepted one final order before her dishwashing shift, 3 meals from a noodle restaurant on Wells Street, to be delivered to an apartment building about 10 minutes away. She secured the delivery bag behind her, pulled up her hood, and set off. At the intersection near the tracks, the light turned yellow. She slowed down. A delivery truck in the lane to her right turned without signaling, and its side mirror struck the handlebar of her scooter. She heard a short, sharp impact, then the street tilted beneath her, and her shoulder slammed against the pavement. The truck continued on, its red taillights disappearing around the corner. Tessa lay on her side on the wet road for several seconds. Then she pushed herself upright. Her scooter had fallen some distance away, its front wheels still spinning. The delivery bag had come open, and all 3 food containers had been thrown onto the sidewalk. 2 of the lids had come off, and broth spread into a dark stain across the concrete, while pale noodles lay scattered through the rainwater. She crawled toward them, dropped to her knees, and began gathering everything. She picked up each lid, wiped the rainwater from the inside, and tried to put it back in place, even though there was no longer any reason to do so. A long cut ran across the fleshy part of her right palm beneath the thumb, with grit lodged inside the wound, and the blood looked thinner than it truly was, because it had mixed with the rain. The left knee of her pants was torn. A man carrying an umbrella walked past on the opposite side of the street, glanced toward her, then continued on his way. A car stopped at the red light, its window lowering halfway before rising again. Tessa sank onto the sidewalk amid the broken food containers, placed both hands on her knees, and didn't cry. She merely sat there in the rain and thought. She didn't think about the truck, the pain throbbing through her shoulder, or the wound in her hand. The only thing moving through her mind was the cost of those 3 meals, added to the delivery fee she wouldn't receive, added to the money she had spent on gas that day. She calculated it silently. $18. She remained there a little longer, then rose, gathered the broken containers, threw them into the trash can at the corner, lifted her scooter upright, checked the handlebars, and pushed it for some distance, until she was certain it could still run. She sent a message to the customer, apologized for an accident on the way, and said she would issue a refund. She arrived at the all-night diner 20 minutes late, apologized to the manager, wrapped her hand with a piece of paper towel and tape from the first aid box hanging on the wall, then took her place at the sink. When the hot water touched the cut, she drew a faint hiss through her teeth, then continued working. Shortly before 4 o'clock in the morning, during her break, she opened her phone to check the application. The order from that evening had been closed. Beneath it was a new rating, 1 star, accompanied by a brief comment saying the delivery had been late and her behavior was unprofessional. She stared at the words for several seconds, then turned off the screen, slipped the phone into her apron pocket, and returned to the sink. The file Grady Nolan placed on the desk on the highest floor of the Caruso Holdings building that week was thicker than any file he had ever compiled on an ordinary person. It contained her name, her age, her apartment address, her younger brother's name, the medical records of her deceased mother, the remaining hospital debt, the 2 years of nursing school she had been forced to leave unfinished, the list of places that had refused to hire her over the previous 3 weeks, and on the final page, the hours of her night shift at a diner beside the elevated train tracks. Enzo read every word without skipping a single page. Then he closed the file and said that documents could say all kinds of things, but a person had to be seen with one's own eyes. On Friday night, the diner was nearly empty. The man entered shortly before 1 o'clock in the morning wearing a dark coat of the kind anyone could buy, with no tie and no watch, and sat at the table in the farthest corner. He ordered black coffee and drank it very slowly. Tessa came to clear the table beside him, greeted him briefly, then returned to the back. She noticed nothing unusual. At night, there were always men sitting alone like that. About half an hour later, a drunken customer seated near the front began raising his voice. He called Tessa over, complained that his coffee was cold, then moved on to something else, his voice growing louder with every sentence as he drew out each word in the manner that any woman working a night shift would recognize immediately. Tessa kept her voice calm and said she would bring him a fresh cup. He refused, rose from his seat, and braced both hands against the table. The man in the farthest corner didn't stand. He merely lifted his eyes from his coffee and looked in that direction. That was all. He didn't speak a word or move a muscle. And the look lasted for about 3 seconds. The drunken man turned, met his eyes, and something inside him seemed to go dark. He stammered an apology, apologized to Tessa as well, dug money from his pocket and hurriedly dropped it on the table, then walked straight out the door, forgetting the coat hanging over the back of his chair. Tessa stood there holding her tray, watched him leave, then looked toward the farthest corner. The man had already lowered his gaze to his coffee, as though nothing had happened. She didn't understand what she had just witnessed. About an hour later, he asked for the check, left a larger tip than usual, nodded to her, and walked out. Tessa cleared his table. On the chair where he had been sitting, a leather wallet lay tilted on its side. She picked it up. It was thick. She opened it to look for identification, and inside was a tightly packed stack of cash, more money than she had ever held in her hands in her entire life. There was no identification card. There was nothing inside except money. Tessa stood motionless for the length of 2 breaths. In her mind, she saw the glass jar on top of the refrigerator, the envelope from the hospital, and the 2 weeks her landlord had given her. Then she set down the tray, told someone in the kitchen that she needed to step outside for a moment, and ran for the door. It was still raining. She saw his figure at the end of the street and chased after him. She ran 1 block, then 2, her shoes soaked through, her shoulder still aching from the previous night, and the bandaged hand throbbing every time she swung her arm. She didn't manage to call out to him until the 3rd block. The man turned, and beneath the streetlights, he watched her standing in the rain, breathless, holding his wallet. She extended it toward him and said he had left it on the chair. He didn't take it immediately. He asked whether she had opened it. She said she had, because she had been looking for identification. He asked whether she knew how much money was inside. Tessa said she hadn't counted it, but she knew it was a great deal. Then he asked another question, and there was no harshness in his voice. It was an honest question. Why hadn't she kept it? There was no identification inside. No one knew who he was. There were no cameras on this stretch of the street, and he had already walked away. No one in the world would ever have known. Tessa stood beneath the rain, her hair plastered to her forehead, and said that she would have known. She said she could endure being poor. She was accustomed to it. There hadn't been a single day in years when she hadn't been poor. But if she lost herself, she would have nothing left, and she was raising a younger brother. The only thing she could still leave him to look toward was the way she chose to live. The man accepted the wallet. He studied her for a very long time, longer than politeness permitted, then thanked her, and told her to go back before she was soaked through. Tessa nodded, turned around, and ran back the 3 blocks. She had no idea that the man remained standing in the rain until her figure had completely disappeared. That same night, while Tessa returned to the sink in her soaked shoes and finished the rest of her shift, in a completely different part of the city, inside a study paneled in dark wood, a man had been sitting before his computer screen since dusk and still hadn't risen. His name was Warwick Sloan. Within the organization, people referred to him by an affectionate nickname that no one dared use in his presence, and every young newcomer was told that if there was anything they were afraid to ask the boss, they could ask Mr. Sloan. He had been there before Enzo Caruso had an office on the highest floor. He had been there before Enzo Caruso became Enzo Caruso. During the winter when that boy was 16, his mother had collapsed in the bathroom after her 2nd office cleaning shift of the day, and he had sat in the hospital corridor throughout the night with 2 empty hands. The following morning, outside the hospital entrance, a well-dressed man of middle age had approached, sat beside him, and said he had a job to offer, paid weekly, beginning that very day, if the boy wanted it. The boy had wanted it. He hadn't asked what the job was. Nearly 20 years had passed since that night, and Warwick Sloan was still sitting in this wood-paneled room. The only difference was that now he needed permission to go up to the highest floor. What was open on the screen before him that night was a draft audit report. Enzo was doing the very thing the entire organization had been whispering about for the past 2 years. He was bringing the whole empire into the light, converting each company into a lawful enterprise, ending everything that wasn't clean, and to accomplish that, every flow of money from the old years had to be uncovered, examined, and explained. The independent auditors had begun with the smaller transportation companies and were steadily working their way upward. Warwick had calculated that they were still about 4 months away from reaching his affairs. That night, he received a revised schedule. 4 months had become 5 weeks. He sat before that figure for a very long time, because throughout all those years, whenever there was money no one wanted to look at, they handed it to him to manage, and he had managed it very well, so well that no one ever thought to check his work. Little by little, year after year, those sums had flowed into places known only to him. He had never considered it stealing. He considered it his share, the portion he deserved for having built all of this from nothing with his own 2 hands, while the name mounted on top of the building belonged to a boy he himself had picked up outside a hospital entrance. At that same moment, in the diner beside the elevated tracks, Tessa finished rinsing the last load of dishes. She dried her hands, sat down on the plastic chair outside the back door, and took a scrap of paper from her apron pocket. It was covered with numbers she had written and rewritten over the past several nights. She added the hours remaining in the 3 weeks, multiplied them by her hourly wage, added the scattered deliveries she might manage during the day, then subtracted the rent, electricity, and food. She performed the calculation for the 4th time, slowly and carefully, exactly as a certain old woman had counted the same stack of money over and over before a bakery counter. And just as it had then, the total refused to change. She was still short. She folded the scrap of paper, slipped it into her pocket, and sat in silence, watching the final train pass overhead. In the wood-paneled study, Warwick Sloane finally rose. He poured himself a drink, stood beside the window, and considered every possibility. He could run, but running would mean losing everything he had accumulated. He could confess, but he knew better than anyone what happened to those who betrayed this organization. Or he could choose a third path. He could make certain the audit never reached him by ensuring that the man who had ordered it was no longer in a position to give orders. He set the glass on the desk, sat down, and opened the leather-bound address book he had kept since the days before anyone used smartphones. He turned to a page near the back, found a name, and dialed the number. The phone rang 3 times. A woman's voice answered, and the first thing she did was demand to know who was calling and why anyone would call at such an hour. 3 days later, in the middle of the afternoon, 2 people sat across from each other at the table, farthest inside the ground-floor cafe of a glass building downtown. The woman had arrived first, wearing sunglasses even though she was indoors, and she had changed tables twice because people kept looking at her. Meredith Hale had endured the worst 3 weeks of her career. The video refused to disappear. 2 major clients had quietly withdrawn from projects already underway, offering various excuses without even bothering to make them convincing. A charitable organization whose board she served on had sent a letter asking her to step away from her role temporarily. Her father had called her exactly once and said only one sentence: "Finish the harbor deal." Then he hung up. And that harbor deal, the only thing that might still save everything, had been postponed indefinitely by the other party without a single word of explanation. The man sat down across from her, ordered a cup of tea, and said he knew exactly why the deal had been postponed. Meredith asked who he was. He merely said that he had been part of that organization long before the man currently in charge had the authority to decide anything. Then he spoke plainly. She needed a signature, while he needed the chair on the highest floor to belong to someone else, and both problems could be solved at the same time. About 40 feet beyond the glass partition, in the row of seats outside the lobby, a young man sat with a backpack resting at his feet. Wade Marlowe had come to wait for his sister, because Tessa had an interview with a delivery company on the 4th floor of the building, and he had asked to accompany her so she wouldn't have to worry. He sat there looking at his phone, occasionally raising his head to glance around, and then he saw the woman seated inside the cafe. He recognized her immediately. Her face had filled his phone screen for the past 3 weeks, appearing in thousands of reposts, edited clips, and comments he had read so many times that he knew them by heart. He sat up straighter. He couldn't hear a single sound. Between his seat and that table stood a thick pane of glass and an entire lobby filled with passing people. But Wade had spent his whole life understanding others by watching their mouths, and the distance didn't matter as long as the 2 people didn't turn their faces away. He watched. The woman said something brief, then pressed her lips together. The man's reply was longer, and Wade caught several words about documents, a deadline, and the name of a company he didn't recognize. He was about to stop watching. Then the man continued, and 3 words in the middle of his sentence made Wade freeze. He mentioned the delivery woman from the video. Wade took out his phone, opened the notes application, and began typing. He recorded whatever he could read, scattered and incomplete. Sometimes only a few isolated words when one of them turned away. The woman asked a question that seemed to be about what would happen if the other man found out. The man laughed. He leaned back in his chair. And in that moment of carelessness, he spoke a complete sentence, clearly, with his face turned directly toward the glass partition. He said the man would never know what had happened that year. Wade typed the sentence into his phone. He didn't understand what it meant. He didn't know who the man was or which year they were talking about. He knew only that these two people had just mentioned his sister, and that one of them was the woman who had laughed in an elderly woman's face inside a bakery. At that moment, Meredith removed her sunglasses to wipe them, and her gaze swept across the glass partition. Wade quickly lowered his eyes to his phone. When he looked up again, both people were standing. They didn't shake hands. The man left first, walking straight toward the revolving door, while the woman remained behind for a moment to pay. A few minutes later, Tessa came downstairs with a folder tucked beneath her arm, and she shook her head before Wade had the chance to ask. He intended to show her his phone right then, but he looked at his sister's face, at the way she forced a smile and said it was all right, that there would be other places, and he slipped the phone into his pocket without saying anything. The following afternoon, Tessa arrived at the apartment on the south side as she did every day, carrying a bag of oranges she had bought cheaply at the market at the end of the street. She reached the second floor and stopped. The apartment door was partly closed, leaving a gap about the width of her hand. Rosa never left her door that way. Tessa pushed it open and saw her lying on her side on the kitchen floor, one arm still draped across the edge of a chair, the kettle overturned beside her feet, its water spreading into a cold pool. The bag of oranges fell from Tessa's hand. She dropped to her knees beside Rosa and called her name twice, but there was no response. The 2 unfinished years of nursing school returned to her faster than thought. She checked Rosa's breathing, pressed 2 fingers to the side of her neck in search of a pulse, and found it still beating, though weakly and irregularly. She turned Rosa onto her side to keep her airway clear, placed a folded towel beneath her head, then called emergency services. She gave the address clearly, 1 number at a time, said the patient was an elderly woman who was unconscious and had drooping on the left side of her face, then added that she suspected a stroke. The dispatcher asked how long Rosa had been lying there. Tessa said she didn't know. As she waited, she held the old woman's hand, which was cold as ice, and spoke to her even though Rosa couldn't hear anything. She told Rosa to hold on, that the ambulance would be there soon. She said she was there and wasn't going anywhere. The ambulance arrived 7 minutes later. They carried Rosa downstairs on a stretcher, and Tessa asked to ride with her. Inside the ambulance, she sat close beside the stretcher, holding Rosa's hand, and when the paramedic asked how she was related to the patient, Tessa hesitated for half a second before saying that she was family. She bent close to the old woman's ear and whispered, almost too softly for anyone but herself to hear, asking Rosa not to leave her, saying that she had already lost one mother and wouldn't lose anyone else. At the hospital, they wheeled Rosa directly into the emergency department, and Tessa was made to remain outside. A short while later, an administrative employee handed her a stack of forms and asked for information about the patient's relatives and who would serve as her representative. Tessa said the old woman lived alone. The employee asked whether she had any children. Tessa was silent for a moment, then said there was a son, but she had no way to contact him. At last, she sat down on a plastic chair in the corridor, rested the forms on her lap, and began filling them out. When she reached the box, asking for her relationship to the patient, she held the pen above the paper for a very long time. Then she wrote a single word: friend. She was signing her name on the final page when the corridor suddenly changed. There was no loud sound. It was only that all the ordinary noises of a hospital corridor in the late afternoon, the rattle of cartwheels, the conversations at the nurse's station, the chime of the elevator, gradually softened and then disappeared entirely. Tessa looked up. At the far end of the corridor, several men in dark clothing stood in a line along the wall, none of them speaking, and one man was walking between them toward her. The head nurse stepped out holding a chart, intending to question them, but then she saw his face and stopped before she could finish. The attending physician approached, then moved aside to clear a path, and Tessa heard him murmur 2 quiet syllables to the person beside him. Caruso. The man walked past her. He wore a black suit without a tie, and there was a faint scar above his left eyebrow. Tessa looked at him, and a chill swept through her entire body. She had seen that face before. She had seen it beneath the lights of the all-night diner beside the elevated tracks, seated at the table in the farthest corner above a cup of black coffee. She had stood breathless in the rain before that face with a wallet in her hand. The man walked directly to the emergency department door, where a young nurse stood in his way, her hand still gripping the handle, because those were the rules and she had been instructed not to let anyone enter. The nurse was so young that perhaps she had never heard the name that had just been whispered in the corridor. She said the patient was being treated and asked him to wait outside. The men standing along the wall didn't move. This man could have bought the entire building before nightfall. He didn't need to ask anyone in this city for anything, and it had been many years since anyone had dared stand in his way. He stopped before the young nurse. Then he lowered his head slightly and said something Grady Nolan, standing several steps away, had never heard him say to anyone in 15 years. "Please. She's my mother." Tessa Marlowe sat on the plastic chair in the corridor, the forms resting on her lap and the pen still in her hand, and raised her eyes to look at him. It was nearly 10 o'clock that night when the attending physician finally came out. He said Rosa had suffered a stroke, but fortunately it was the kind they could treat. And what had made all the difference was that she had reached the hospital within the critical window. He added that if she had arrived even 1 hour later, they would be having an entirely different conversation. He asked who had found her. The corridor fell silent. Then the head nurse pointed toward the plastic chair. The man in the black suit turned his head and looked in that direction. Rosa was moved to an observation room, still unconscious and with severe weakness on her left side, but no longer in critical danger. Only one visitor was allowed inside at a time, and the man went in. He remained there for about 20 minutes, and no one knew what he did or said during that time. When he came out, all the men in dark clothing had been sent away. Only Grady remained at the far end of the corridor. The man walked over to Tessa and sat on the plastic chair beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them. He didn't thank her immediately. He sat in silence for a long time, his elbows resting on his knees and his eyes lowered to the tiled floor. In that moment, he looked no different from any other son sitting in a hospital corridor at midnight. At last, he said he knew what she was thinking. Tessa replied that she couldn't think at all. He asked whether she was afraid. She said she was too tired to have become frightened yet. He gave a quiet, brief laugh that held no amusement. Then he began to explain. He said that one summer, 6 years earlier, someone had come to him carrying a file. Inside were photographs of his mother at the market, at the bus stop, and outside her apartment, all taken from a distance on different days. There was also a record of her daily routine, the time she left home and the time she returned. The person who brought him the file said that someone was searching for his weakness, that they had found it, and that as long as he continued visiting that apartment, she would remain a target. He said he had sat inside his car outside his mother's building until nearly dawn that night. He saw the kitchen light come on at 5 o'clock, because she had always been in the habit of waking early. Then he told the driver to leave, and he never returned. He said he had convinced himself it was the only way, that it was better for her to be unhappy than for something to happen to her, and that he would send money regularly so she would never lack anything. He said he had believed that for 6 years. Tessa listened to everything without interrupting him once. She didn't ask what he did for a living, ask who the men lining the corridor that afternoon had been, or move her chair farther away. When he finished, she sat quietly for a while, and then she spoke. She said that afternoon, Rosa had been lying on the kitchen floor, and if Tessa hadn't gone there, no one else would have come. She said there was a table in that apartment with 2 chairs, but only one had marks of wear on its back. She said unopened envelopes filled with money were stacked inside the sideboard, so many that Rosa no longer bothered to count them. Then she turned to look at him and said that he had kept his mother safe. That much was true. But he had starved her heart for 6 years. She said his money could buy the entire city, could buy the very hospital where they were sitting, but it couldn't buy a single meal cooked by his mother. She said Rosa had once told her that she was a good cook, but now she had no one left to cook for. She said Rosa had never needed anything else. That was all she had ever needed. The man said nothing. He sat there with his hands clasped together, and beneath the midnight lights of the corridor, Tessa saw his jaw tighten. It had been many years since anyone had dared speak to Enzo Caruso that way. Within the organization, people measured every word before speaking to him. Beyond its walls, people only dared say his name after lowering their voices. Yet this young woman had just sat beside him in a hospital corridor, after a day so long that her hands still hadn't stopped trembling, and told him directly what no one else in the world would have dared say. At last, he spoke, his voice rough and strained, and asked only one question. Had she ever mentioned him? Tessa replied that Rosa hadn't spoken about him. She had waited for him. Those were two different things. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Enzo Caruso entered the second-floor apartment on the south side for the first time in 6 years. He told Grady to wait downstairs in the car. He stood in the middle of the living room for a long time before turning on the light, because in the darkness, everything remained exactly where his memory had left it. The armchair in the corner, the old radio on top of the cabinet, the curtains over the window overlooking the concrete courtyard. He switched on the light, and the first thing he saw was the dining table against the wall with its 2 chairs. He walked over and placed a hand on the back of the inner chair, polished smooth by years of use, then touched the other, the one whose paint remained as untouched as it had been on the day it was purchased. He pulled his hand away very quickly. He went into the kitchen, picked up the kettle from the floor, and wiped away the water that had dried into a stain. Then he opened the sideboard. Inside were stacks of envelopes, one piled upon another, bound with rubber bands, and not one had been opened. He stood looking at them for a while, then closed the cabinet. He entered the bedroom. The bed had been made perfectly smooth, the pillows placed neatly at the head, and an empty glass sat on the nightstand. He lowered himself onto the edge of the bed, and perhaps he would have remained there until morning if he hadn't noticed something beneath it when he looked down. It was a tin box, the kind that had once held cookies, with nearly all the lettering worn from its lid. He pulled it out and opened it. Inside there was no money and no paperwork. There were newspaper clippings, hundreds of them, cut with great care, every edge perfectly straight, stacked in chronological order, with the oldest at the bottom, yellowed and brittle with age. The first clipping he picked up was an article about a dispute over operating rights at the harbor. His name appeared 3 times in the story, but there was no photograph. In the margin, written in pencil, was a single line in slanted, trembling handwriting. It said nothing about the harbor or the dispute. It merely said that people claimed he was working too hard. He turned to the next clipping, then the one after that. Every clipping had a penciled note in the margin. Beside one, she had written that he looked thinner in the photograph. Beside another, she had written that he had cut his hair, and that this style suited him better. One contained only a few words, saying that it was cold that day and she wondered whether he was dressed warmly enough. There was a clipping about an accident at the docks one year, and in the margin she had written only that she hadn't slept all night. At last, he reached the badly blurred photograph, secretly taken from a distance, the only image the city's newspapers had ever obtained, showing nothing but the back of a man in black stepping onto a pier. It had been carefully cut out and pasted onto a sheet of white paper to keep it flat. Beneath it, she had written in pencil that this was her son. She recognized the way he walked. Enzo Caruso sat on the edge of his mother's bed in the second-floor apartment at 2 o'clock in the morning, the open tin box resting on his lap, and understood something he had never once considered in 6 years. She had known. She knew who he was, knew what he did, knew the things the entire city dared speak of only in whispers. She had read every line people wrote about him, cut each one out, put it away, then sat at the table with 2 chairs, and written in the margin that her son looked thinner. She had never been unaware. She had only waited. He drove back to the building before dawn. He went directly to the highest floor, left the ceiling lights off, switched on only the desk lamp, and opened the upper left drawer. Inside were the envelopes, one for every year, each placed there by Grady's own hand, and not one had been opened. Enzo hadn't possessed the courage, because opening them would mean admitting that she was still there, still standing in the lobby of this building once every year, while he remained up here, exactly 60 floors above her. He took out the oldest envelope, the one at the very bottom, and opened it. Inside was a cheap paper card with a flower printed in one corner. The handwriting was slanted and unsteady, identical to the penciled notes in the margins of the newspaper clippings. She had written, "Happy birthday, my son." Then on the next line she had added one short sentence, "I still set aside your share of the meal." He opened the second envelope. The same sentence. The third. Still the same. He opened every envelope, one by one, until he reached the last. And across all 6 of those inexpensive cards was a single line repeated throughout 6 years, patiently, without accusation, without questions, without asking for anything at all. The man whose name made all of Chicago lower its voice collapsed over his desk amid 6 cheap paper cards, and he wept like a child. Rosa remained in the hospital for 2 weeks before she was allowed to return home. Her left arm was still weak, and she needed someone to support her when she walked. But she could speak and eat, and the first thing she asked after fully regaining consciousness was where they had put the phone with the crack in the corner of its screen. A nurse had been arranged to stay with her during the day. A car brought her all the way to her door, and someone came to repair the front step she often tripped over. Rosa didn't ask who had arranged any of it. She merely sat in her familiar chair beside the dining table, one hand resting over the pocket of her sweater, and watched the door more often than before. On the afternoon, Rosa returned home. Wade handed his phone to his sister. He had kept the information to himself for nearly 3 weeks. He signed that he didn't understand what any of it meant, but the woman from the bakery had mentioned Tessa, and he thought she should see it. Tessa read the note twice. Most of it consisted of isolated, fragmented words that couldn't be connected into anything meaningful. But the final line contained one complete sentence, and after reading it for the 3rd time, she rose and reached for her coat. That evening, she sat in a glass-paneled room on the highest floor of the Caruso Holdings building and placed her brother's phone on the dark wooden desk. Enzo read the note. He read very quickly, then stopped at the final line and remained motionless long enough for a chill to travel down Tessa's spine. He asked whether her brother was certain. She said Wade had been reading lips since he was 5 years old, and he had never been wrong. Enzo called Grady into the room, handed him the phone, and gave a single order. Get me every document from that summer, including the originals, the source, and the person who brought them to me. Grady looked at the words on the screen, and the color drained from his face. 2 days later, everything was on the desk. Tessa sat in the chair opposite Enzo as he turned to the final page. And when he spoke, his voice was so even that it was frightening. He said the photographs of his mother from that year were real. They had truly been taken at the market, at the bus stop, and outside her apartment. But the person who took them wasn't an enemy. That person had been paid, and the payment appeared in the company's records. It had been approved and signed. Enzo said he had just seen the signature. Then he said that the supposed threat from that year had never existed. No one had been searching for his weakness. No one had been watching the apartment. The entire story had been constructed from beginning to end by one person, someone who knew exactly what to do to make Enzo believe it. Tessa asked why. Enzo remained silent for a while, then said his mother was the only person who could still have persuaded him to stop. As long as he continued sitting down to eat at that table, with 2 chairs every week, there remained a chance that one day he would listen to her and walk away from all of this. And the man who had spent all those years building everything around Enzo couldn't allow that to happen. So he severed that bond. He didn't need to hurt anyone. He only needed to place a file in Enzo's hands and let Enzo abandon his mother with his own hands. Enzo pushed the file toward the center of the desk, and his voice grew completely hoarse as he spoke his final words. He said he had believed an enemy had taken his mother from him. It turned out he had lost her because he trusted the wrong man. At that exact moment, the phone in Tessa's coat pocket vibrated. She took it out, thinking it was probably Wade, but it wasn't a message. It was an automated notification from the location application she had installed one night in the 2nd-floor apartment. The application she hadn't opened since, because she had never needed it. A small glowing dot appeared on the map. It wasn't on the south side. It was moving steadily and quickly along the main road heading north, and it had nearly reached the edge of the city. It had begun about 40 minutes earlier on the 2nd floor of the building on the south side. There was a knock at the door, and when Rosa opened it, 2 men in respectable coats stood outside. They had stepped back a pace out of courtesy, and neither tried to enter. The older man greeted her warmly and addressed her with respect, saying they were from the company. Then he spoke the words she had been waiting to hear. He said her son had sent them to bring her to him. Rosa stood in the doorway, unable to speak for several seconds. The man continued, saying her son was waiting at work, that he had instructed them to bring her immediately so she wouldn't be late, and that this time he had finally managed to arrange everything. Rosa asked whether her son had truly said that. The man replied that yes, those were his instructions. She turned and went back inside. The daytime nurse had left at 6 o'clock. Rosa took the coat hanging behind the door, put it on over her gray sweater, and wrapped the faded scarf around her neck. Then she stopped in the middle of the room and looked toward the kitchen. She turned back, opened the refrigerator, took out the container of food she had prepared at noon, and carefully wrapped it in a paper bag. Carrying it with her, she stepped outside, closed the door herself, and locked it with her own hands. No one touched her. No one hurried her. She descended both flights of stairs on her own feet, one hand gripping the railing, and she moved faster than she had at any point during the past week. The man opened the car door for her. Rosa settled into the back seat, placed the paper bag on her lap, wrapped both hands around it, and stared straight ahead throughout the journey. For 6 years, she had waited to hear the very words that had just been spoken at her doorway. Inside the pocket of her sweater, carefully buttoned as it was every day, the phone with the crack in the corner of its screen remained on and continued transmitting its location. In the glass-paneled room on the highest floor, Tessa sprang to her feet so suddenly that her chair toppled over. She held out the screen for Enzo to see. He stared at the glowing dot for exactly 2 seconds, then rushed toward the door, making calls as he went, and the entire floor erupted with the sound of running feet. Grady asked which route they were taking. Enzo named the main road heading north, but Tessa had already raced down the stairs. She didn't wait for the elevator or for anyone else. She reached her scooter at the corner of the parking lot and started the engine. She didn't take the main road. At this hour, the northbound road was a river of red lights stretching for miles, and 3 years of making deliveries had taught her something no map ever could. The city had 2 road systems layered over each other. One belonged to people sitting inside cars. The other belonged to people who had to deliver an order before the food grew cold. She entered the second system. She wove through the alley behind the row of restaurants on Wells Street, cut across the wholesale market parking lot, slipped beneath a viaduct too narrow for a car, then turned onto a one-way street in the wrong direction because she knew no one used it at this hour. Her phone was secured in the holder in front of her, with the moving dot on one side of the screen and a call playing through the speaker on the other. She reported its movements as she rode. It had just passed the intersection at North Avenue. It hadn't turned. It was continuing straight. It had just slowed down, probably for the red light near the overpass. Enzo's voice came through the small speaker, asking where she was, and when she named the alley, he fell silent for a moment before saying there was no road there wide enough for a vehicle. Tessa replied that there was, if he was willing to lose his rearview mirrors. The wind struck her face with biting cold. Her right hand, where the cut still hadn't fully healed, throbbed every time she twisted the throttle. She hadn't slept more than 4 hours over the past 2 days. The glowing dot left the residential district, turned left, then turned left again, and Tessa recognized the direction before the map could display the street name. She spoke into the phone, saying they weren't taking Rosa out of the city. They were circling back. They were heading toward the harbor. There was a very brief silence on the other end. Then Enzo's voice returned, and this time it had changed completely. It was lower and slower, the voice Grady Nolan had learned to fear during 15 years of service. Enzo said he knew the place. The glowing dot began to slow, entered an area shown on the map only as a nameless gray expanse, then stopped completely. It had stopped among the old warehouses at the edge of the northern harbor, where rows of shipping containers stretched beneath the high floodlights, and where not a single person passed after dark. Enzo Caruso entered the warehouse district alone. He told Grady to stop outside the fence and remain there, and when Grady tried to object, Enzo merely said that if he went in with his men, the night would end exactly the way Warwick wanted it to. He walked between 2 rows of shipping containers beneath the sickly yellow glow of the floodlights, and in the open yard beyond them, everything had already been arranged. A folding table stood in the middle of the yard. Several men were positioned around it, and Rosa sat on a plastic chair beside the table, still clutching the paper bag in her lap. She wasn't tied up. No one stood near her. She merely sat there in confusion, looking around for a familiar face, and when she saw her son emerge from the darkness, she sprang to her feet. Warwick Sloane stepped forward first, raising a hand to signal his men to move back, and said Enzo had arrived sooner than he expected. Enzo didn't look at him. He looked at his mother. Warwick continued, saying that no harm had come to her, that they had invited her politely and she had entered the car willingly, and that Enzo could ask her himself. Then he placed a stack of documents on the folding table and said this was what he wanted. He wanted the audit stopped. He wanted signing authority transferred into his name. He said this wasn't theft. It was reclamation. He told Enzo to remember what he had been that morning outside the hospital entrance. A 16-year-old boy sitting on the steps, his hands empty, with no idea how he would pay his mother's hospital bill the following day. Warwick said he was the one who had sat down beside that boy, He was the one who had taught him how to speak, how to carry himself, and how to make other people fall silent when he entered a room. The name mounted on the top of that building belonged to Enzo, but everything that gave that name its weight belonged to Warwick. Then he lowered his voice until it sounded almost intimate, and said that Enzo needed to do only one thing now: give the order. Give it the way he had in the old days, and everything would return to the way it had been. No one would ever need to mention this night again. Enzo finally turned to look at him. He asked who had paid for the photographs of his mother at the bus stop. Warwick didn't answer. Enzo asked who had taken those 6 years from them. Warwick remained silent for the length of 2 breaths, then said he had done what needed to be done, because if Enzo had continued sitting down to eat at that table every week, none of this would ever have existed. She would have persuaded him to abandon everything, and Enzo would have listened. He always listened to her. Enzo nodded slowly, as though the final missing truth had just been confirmed. Then he spoke. He said Warwick had raised a beast. Warwick had taught it how to walk, how to speak, and how to make people lower their eyes when it entered a room. That much was true, and Enzo wouldn't deny it. But the woman sitting on that plastic chair had given birth to a human being, and she had waited 6 years to see whether that human being still existed. Enzo said that tonight he was choosing to be her son. Warwick laughed and asked what he intended to do. Call the police? Enzo replied that he already had. The entire yard fell silent. He said the complete audit file, all the records from 20 years, and every payment bearing Warwick's signature had been turned over to federal investigators that afternoon. He said he had surrendered everything. Warwick said Enzo had lost his mind, that his own name appeared in those documents too. Enzo said he knew. One of Warwick's men stepped forward, and for one brief moment, a struggle broke out in the middle of the yard. Feet pounded against the concrete, and a plastic chair overturned. Enzo moved in front of his mother and shielded her with his body. Then the entire yard flooded with light. Blinding white beams swept in from 3 directions at once, racing across the walls of the shipping containers, while a voice thundered through a loudspeaker, ordering everyone to remain where they were. Warwick's men stopped in their tracks. Warwick Sloane stood motionless in the middle of the yard beneath that light, and in that moment, he suddenly looked every year of his true age. Tessa ran in through the gate, breathless, and she was the first person to reach the plastic chair. Rosa was still clutching the paper bag tightly in her lap. She looked at Tessa, then at the man standing protectively in front of her, and said very softly, "I brought you dinner." Meredith Hale was called in for questioning on Tuesday morning of the following week. She arrived with 3 attorneys, and after sitting in that room for less than 20 minutes, she understood that even 3 attorneys couldn't save her. They placed before her the record of the meeting in the ground floor cafe of the glass building, along with a copy of the call history connected to a number found in a leather-bound address book, and asked what she knew about what had happened in the warehouse district at the Northern Harbor. She requested a private conversation with the prosecutor. Then Meredith Hale told them everything. She described the first call, the meeting, every proposal, and everything she had been promised if the deal was signed. She handed Warwick over completely, withholding not a single detail, in exchange for consideration as a cooperating witness. Her cooperation was taken into account. She didn't receive the harshest penalty, but Hale Development didn't survive that autumn. Her father removed her from the executive board during a meeting that lasted less than an hour. The 3 women who had laughed beside her in the bakery had quietly deleted every photograph of themselves with her several weeks earlier, and there was an irony that Tessa would struggle to name even years later. The woman who had left an elderly woman standing speechless in the middle of a bakery was also the person who ultimately brought down the man who had stolen 6 years from that same elderly woman. No one had arranged it that way. It had simply happened. Warwick Sloane was indicted on a long list of financial charges, and he entered the courtroom wearing the expression of a man who still believed, until the very end, that he had merely been reclaiming what belonged to him. During that same week, the young customer who had been seated near the bakery window posted her video again, this time uploading the complete, unedited recording, which was longer than the version the city had seen. The full video contained a scene no one had witnessed before, showing a woman in a delivery uniform kneeling to gather every coin from beneath the counter and placing them in the elderly woman's hand, then opening her own wallet and laying everything she had on the counter. The delivery application sent Tessa a letter, and this time, a real person called her. They said her account had been restored, that she would be compensated for the entire period of the suspension, and that the company apologized for acting upon a false complaint. Tessa thanked them and agreed to return. That evening, she told Wade that at least now she could earn her living again through her own work. Then, the following month, after everything had settled, a stack of documents was delivered to her. They were records of medical debt purchases made by subsidiaries of Hale Development, disclosed during the investigation, and someone thought she should review them, because many of the cases resembled her own circumstances. She sat at the dining table in her apartment and turned through the pages one by one. Hundreds of names, hundreds of families. Hospital debts purchased for almost nothing, and then collected at full value. Files deliberately classified as bad debt, so hospitals would have an excuse to discontinue treatment plans. Tessa reached a page somewhere in the teens, and her hand stopped. In the middle of the page, surrounded by dozens of other names, was her mother's name. The date beside it was from the winter, 2 years earlier. The very winter when the doctor had called Tessa in and said the final round of chemotherapy would have to be postponed because of a payment issue. The winter when she had run everywhere trying to borrow money and hadn't found it in time. In the final column of that row, in the space reserved for the signature approving the transfer of the account into bad debt status, there was a handwritten name, Meredith Hale. Tessa sat motionless for a very long time, holding the page in her hands. Darkness had fallen beyond the window. She thought about that morning in the bakery, about the moment she set down the delivery bag and took 3 steps forward. At the time, she had seen only an elderly woman being laughed at. That was all. Nothing else had been in her mind. She hadn't known that the woman standing opposite her that morning had signed her name into Tessa's life 2 years earlier, before they had ever seen each other's faces. While Tessa was sitting in the corridor of another hospital, begging someone to allow her mother one more round of treatment. Wade's surgery took place on a morning in early winter, and by the day his device was activated, another month had passed. The doctor warned them not to expect too much from the first attempt, that sounds would initially seem strange and distorted, and that it would take months of practice before his brain learned how to understand them. Tessa sat in a chair across from her brother in that small room, her hands clasped tightly together. The technician switched on the device. Wade startled, his entire body becoming rigid, and his eyes widened as he looked around the room as though someone had just poured a bucket of water over his head. Then the doctor motioned for Tessa to speak. She opened her mouth, but she couldn't think of anything profound to say, so she simply called her brother's name. Wade turned sharply toward her. He stared at her, then began to laugh. Then his eyes filled with tears, and soon he was laughing and crying at the same time. He raised both hands and began signing so quickly and chaotically that he had to repeat himself before she understood. He said her voice was far more beautiful than he had ever imagined. Tessa covered her mouth. No one in that small room managed to remain composed that day. Not even the technician who had been doing this work for 20 years. In another courtroom that same winter, Enzo Caruso received his sentence. The evidence he had personally surrendered was what convicted him, and his attorney had suggested more than once that he withdraw part of the file, but Enzo refused every time. His voluntary confession and complete cooperation were taken into account, so he didn't receive the harshest sentence, but it was still enough time for a man to count. On the afternoon before he left, Tessa asked whether he was afraid. He considered the question for a moment, then said that for the past 6 years, he had lived inside a prison built by his own hands, without windows, without guards, and without a release date. He said that at least the place he was going had a date when he could leave. Then he added that this time, he wouldn't disappear. He would call home every week, and his mother mustn't exhaust herself by cooking too much. The Rosa Fund was established with the legal assets that remained, and Rosa Caruso was its named owner. Because of that, it wasn't affected by anything that happened afterward. The fund had one purpose. It helped cover medical expenses for working people without adequate insurance, and purchased hospital debts sold to third parties so those debts could be erased. Tessa Marlowe served as its director. Someone on the board asked what qualifications she had in that field. Rosa replied that the girl had spent 2 years on the other side of that system and had been crushed beneath it. So she knew every opening, every trap, and every line of fine print people deliberately made difficult to read. No one asked another question. And every Sunday, Rosa still cooked. She prepared enough food for 4 people, set the table, and continued saving one person's share. Tessa and Wade came to eat with her. Then the 3 of them washed the dishes together, listened to the old radio on top of the cabinet, and heard Rosa tell stories about the past. The dining table against the wall now had 4 chairs. By the day the entire family had been counting down to for so long, When the gate opened and that man stepped outside carrying a cloth bag, it was almost noon. He entered the waiting car, and it took him directly to the south side, up 2 flights of stairs, and to that familiar door. The door was unlocked. Inside, on the table, surrounded by 4 chairs, the meal had already been served, and it was still warm. This story leaves us with one very simple truth. Kindness never asks whether we are rich or poor before it speaks, and sometimes, the person who dares step forward and stand against cruelty is the very person who has nothing left to lose. Respect every human being you meet along the way, because you never know what pain they are silently carrying, and you can never know what miracle might bring one small act of kindness back to you. Above all, please don't make the people who love you wait too long beside a meal that has grown cold, because money can be earned again, but the time we could have spent eating together can never be recovered. If today's story touched your heart, please press the like button, share this video with the people you love, and subscribe to our channel so we can listen to more meaningful stories together every day. How did this story make you feel? Was there something in it that reminded you of someone you love? Please leave us a few words in the comments, because we truly want to hear the feelings that come from the deepest part of your heart. We wish everyone watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next video.